Hello and welcome back to Sweet Sycamore. My name is Nicole, and if you are joining us for the first time, welcome. We are on episode 16 of our Esther series. Yeah, it's gone by fast, and this is a 20 episode series as we dig into the book of Esther, and we have uncovered some major gems in this book. But today we are going to wrap up chapter 8, and we're going to start at verse 9. But before we do, just to give you a short recap, Esther and Mordecai have officially been given the reins. They have kind of convinced King Xerxes that the edict wasn't the best edict to put into place in the first place. And so King Xerxes has basically said, do what you may, do what you want, but then he reminds them that this edict that is in play cannot be reversed. And we see that historically in this time period, that there was actually this fundamental article in their Magna Carta that no law or decree that once it had passed with the royal approval, that king's signet ring, that it could not be recalled. So now Esther and Mordecai have to figure out what to do. They can't just say, okay, now this law doesn't exist. It will exist. It was signed with the king's signet ring. So how can they protect the Jewish people when a law is in place that will actually kill them? Well, let's go back to Esther 3 and just have a short reminder of what this edict actually said. It's in Esther 3, it starts in verse 13, and it says, dispatches were sent by swift messengers into all the provinces of the empire, giving the order that all Jews, young and old, including women and children, must be killed, slaughtered, and annihilated on a single day. This was scheduled to happen on March 7th of the next year. The property of the Jews would be given to those who killed them. So this law is in place, and now they have to figure out how to protect the Jewish people when they can't change anything about this existing law. So verse 9, when we come back to chapter 8, it starts off with, so on June 25th. I absolutely love when the Bible gives us specific dates, because then we can really see where the timetable of the story hits. So we know that the proclamation was put into effect on April 17th. That's when they sent out those swift messengers. It tells us that in Esther 3. But it has taken Esther 70 days, because now we're sitting at June 25th, in order to get a hold of the king, whether how long it took Mordecai to get a hold of her, how long it took her to schedule these dinners. I have no idea, but we do know that it was 70 days from when the proclamation went out to when we have this new proclamation coming out. 70 days. So it's 70 days of people thinking they're going to die, 70 days of perhaps non-Jewish people preparing on which Jewish neighbor they're going to take out. I could only imagine the tension within these 70 days. But the great thing is we are still 9 months from that date that the edict is actually supposed to take place. So they have 9 months in order to get this new edict out. So verse 9, so on June 25th, the king's secretaries were summoned, and a decree was written exactly as Mordecai dictated. It was sent to the Jews and to the highest officers, the governors, and the nobles of all the 127 provinces, stretching from India to Ethiopia. The decree was written in the scripts and languages of all the peoples of the empire, including that of the Jews. What I find interesting here is this is very similar wording to that of Esther 3 when it talks about the original edict. But what is added here that is not in that chapter is including that of the Jews. What this lets me know is that original edict that Haman sent out was not in the language of the Jews. In other words, he didn't want them to even think that they had a moment to prepare or how to prepare themselves. He wanted everybody else to hear about how they could kill them, how they could take the property of the Jews, and the Jews to feel like they were such second-class citizens that they weren't even worthy of actually finding out about their own murder. Now, we know they found out about it because, news like that is going to spread incredibly fast. But what I find interesting here as we dig into this last portion of verse 9, it says, including that of the Jews. And so this was written specifically to them, this next edict. It's in their language. It's for them to understand. They are supposed to fully understand this second edict. In verse 10, it says, the decree was written in the name of King Xerxes and sealed with the king's signet ring. Mordecai sent the dispatches by swift messengers who rode fast horses, especially bred for the king's service. Verse 11, the king's decree gave the Jews in every city authority to unite to defend their lives. They were allowed to kill, slaughter, and annihilate anyone of any nationality or province who might attack them or their children and wives, and they could take the property of their enemies. The same day was chosen for this event throughout all the provinces of King Xerxes, which was March 7th of the next year. What this is saying is that when that clock strikes midnight, 12:01, on March 7th, both edicts will come into play. Now, when we finish on verse 13, it says, a copy of this decree was to be issued as law in every province and proclaimed to all peoples, so that the Jews would be ready to take revenge on their enemies on the appointed day. So urged on by the king's command, the messengers rode out swiftly on fast horses bred for the king's service. The same decree was also proclaimed in the fortress of Susa. Now, when we look at both of these decrees that are supposed to come into play on March 7th, there's a little difference. They look pretty identical, except for one line, which says that the Jews have the authority to unite and defend themselves. The first edict, they would have been punished for defending themselves because they would have been breaking that edict from the king, right? If you would have taken up arms against somebody coming at you who is doing so on behalf of the king, then you would be a traitor yourself and therefore you should die anyways. So they had no authority. They could not defend themselves. It was against the law for them to defend themselves because it would go against the first edict. This second edict says you have the right to defend yourself. So although it does not counteract the first edict is still in play, that non-Jewish people can attack Jewish people and they can take all the possessions they want the Jewish people owned. Now, I have to tell you, the Jewish people were pretty savvy, and it makes it sound like as if they had some great possessions that people may have wanted to gain. And so I'm sure that this sounded enticing to some people. But now we have this counter edict that says, hey, the Jews can defend themselves. You can't just take something. They are actually able to fight back. They are armed and they can take you. And by the way, if they take you out, they get whatever you own. So at least now we are on equal playing fields. So I think a lot of people look at this second edict, and when it includes women and children, just like the first edict did, a lot of people look at that and say, man, Mordecai was just as bad as Haman. I mean, Haman should have never put in there that they can go after women and children too. It should have been like a man-on-man battle. Take it like that. But when I look at this and where a lot of people are like, oh, that's so harsh, Mordecai was just as bad as Haman, I need us to understand this from like a person-to-person standpoint. You see, Haman had basically said in that first edict that you need to go after the men and the women and the children. Now, there was a purpose for that because the men solely took part and they took care of their family. Women at the time could not work. It was against the law for them to work. So if it was a man-on-man battle, you would have a lot of women and children who would now be dependent on the government for them to take care of. So in honesty, this is a horrible way to look at it, but this is just the way it was done at the time. You take them all out, and then you take all of those possessions. Therefore, the government doesn't have to worry about anything. It's just been taking out the entire problem. I'm not saying that that was good. I think that was absolutely horrid. But that's just the way it was. Now, the second edict includes the same thing. But I need us to see that Mordecai didn't say that the Jewish people could just go after the non-Jewish people to take their things. It says in this edict that it is about self-defense only, that if a non-Jew comes at you for your possessions, including your wife and your children, you have every right to defend yourself and you can fight back. And then it says, and you can take out their wife and their children and their possessions. But the idea was all dependent on self-defense. So to go back to that original question, I actually don't think that this was too harsh to include this in the second edict, because this was all about to disentice the Persian people from going after the Jews. And it was giving the right of self-defense to the Jews. Did you know that you have the right of self-defense against your enemy? I think so often we cling to love, and yes, it is the greatest commandment, second greatest technically, to love others. The first is to love the Lord with all your heart, soul, and mind, and the second is to love others. But loving others does not mean that you roll over and you become a doormat and you let people take out your kids, take out your wife, take out your husband, take your possessions. My friends, that is not love when people come at us. You have the right of self-defense. And one thing I think we need to know as Christians is we should self-defend our family, our loved ones. We need to be able to protect them from our enemy. And we have a very real enemy out there that is coming after our children and our families, maybe through phones, through TVs, through the internet. Are we self-defending? Are we taking this and going, wait a minute, this is something that I have the right to protect? I often think of it like if somebody were to come in my home, if my children and my husband were in my home and somebody were trying to break in the doors, you can guarantee that I would armor up and be ready to take somebody out. I mean, yes, I'd be calling 911 and getting all the proper authorities in place, but I would be protecting my family. Do we do that in the spiritual realm? Because did you know that there's people knocking at the door of your kids on their internet devices, that there is people knocking at the door of your husband's business, right? And trying to get into him and convince him that he needs to go to leave his family. I don't know what it may be, but there is a real enemy out there. And are we protecting our family from the spiritual realm too? Okay, I want to take this idea of self-defense one step further. Do we self-defend and provide our family the tools to self-defend from lies that live in our heads as truths? Those things that are not true, but we allow them to live in our thoughts, and all of a sudden these lies start to become our truths. Another example could be a sin in our life or a sin we see in one of our direct family members' lives that we don't call what it is. We don't call it a sin. We just keep justifying it, even though we know it's not of God, even though it's something we know that God does not want us to do. We still don't call it what it is, and we keep justifying it. And maybe even thinking, I'm just going to wait it out. I'm just going to see what happens. Waiting it out is not a self-defense unless God is calling you to say, just chill and let me handle this. But most of the time, God wants us to stand up for what is right and also being able to stand up for what is wrong. And that is self-defense. That is protecting ourselves, protecting our character, and protecting the character of people we love in our family. Problems don't just disappear. Sometimes we have to be brave and bold, and we have to stand up and we have to fight. But we have to fight for the right things. As we study Esther, we've been talking a lot about her meekness, but her meekness did not make her complacent. Oftentimes we may correlate the two things, but meekness, when we are actually leaning into God's strength and controlling our anger, emotions, who we are by God's strength, actually will lead us into a level of boldness, not complacency. Esther was bold, even though she walked in meekness and humility. And God, I believe, requires the same things out of us. Are we fighting the right battles? Are we just feisty people? Are we fighting for what God wants us to fight? We're actually fighting the enemy. We're fighting for our kids and our families to have strong character. We're fighting to keep the enemy at bay for our families. That is the beautiful fight that God wants us to fight. And He wants us to be bold and not be complacent, because that's when the enemy just takes over without us even knowing it, when we just walk through life being complacent. Okay, let's go back to the story here with the Jewish people. Enough of that little short sermon. But you see, their problems didn't just disappear. I mean, there's still a fight that they have to actually fight for the right things, and that is fighting for their family, fighting for who they are. And they have a fight ahead of them. I mean, why couldn't God just have taken away the fight? Why couldn't he have figured out a way to make March 7th just disappear off of the calendar? I mean, God is a creative God. Why didn't he? Well, I really believe that God wasn't about trying to make life easy on the Jewish people. He was trying to build a relationship with the Jewish people. And yes, they had a fight ahead of them, and so do we. But he was trying to make sure that they would lean into him as the fight was coming up. He was building their character. I mean, I would be horrible on the battlefield if somebody stuck me out in the middle of a war. I would hide behind a rock and probably be terrified of my life. But if you stuck my kids right beside me on that battlefield, you better believe it, I'm going to be like Xena warrior princess out there. Because when you put me in a place where I have to fight for my family, oh man, I am going to be fighting. And that is where God is putting on the Jewish people, you need to fight for who you are. You need to fight for existing on this earth, yes, but fight because God has given you an opportunity, a beautiful opportunity to protect yourself, to self-defend against your enemy. Verse 15, it says, Then Mordecai left the king's presence, wearing the royal robe of blue and white, and the great crown of gold, and an outer cloak of fine linen and purple. And the people of Susa celebrated the new decree. Mordecai's life has changed dramatically in a handful of days. He has gone from wearing sackcloth and ashes to wearing royal robes. And just so you know, God can do that kind of transformation even in our own lives that fast when he wants to. I love here where it says like the whole group of people, Susa, celebrated. That means that Jews and Persians both celebrated. Nobody liked this original decree of the Jewish people being annihilated. These were people that they lived amongst. These were friends. The whole city center, which is named Susa, that was a city center, it was made mostly of Persians, and we actually see their sympathy towards the Jews in their own celebration. As it says, the people of Susa celebrated. Do we celebrate when things don't even affect us? And I hope we do. I hope when our brothers and sisters are struggling and we see God intervene that we celebrate for them. Verse 16 says, The Jews were filled with joy and gladness and were honored everywhere. In every province and city, wherever the king's decree arrived, the Jews rejoiced and had a great celebration and declared a public festival and holiday. And many of the people of the land became Jews themselves, for they feared what the Jews might do to them. I find this so interesting, this last line, because the Jews went from being hated to actually honored when they saw God intervene in their life. When people see God intervene in your life, which by the way means we have to be a little bit vulnerable in our life to be able to see where God is intervening, do they celebrate God in your life? Do they see God in your life? You see, people are seeing God in the Jewish people and what he is doing, and they actually want to become Jews. It says that people joined them and became Jews. Now, we aren't speaking of nationality. It's not like you can change your DNA of who you are. We are talking about religion. And although the DNA and the religion are very intertwined for the Jewish people, we are talking that people decided that they were going to be Jewish in the fact that they worshiped the one true God, that they followed the Jewish laws, which would bring all of these Persians closer to God. Maybe some of these Persians became Jews out of fear, thinking, well, I want to be under the umbrella of the one true God because I'm seeing the way that he is showing up for these Jewish people. See, people that believed in the one true God, yes, we call them Jews here. Today we call them Christians. And people will be coming at us left and right, just as people come after the Jewish people today and back during this time. Being a Christian doesn't always feel safe. I feel like people are constantly coming at me and degrading me for my faith. Yet I still find it safer to be a Christian than not to be. The crazy thing is when people start seeing God show up in my life, they start thinking the same thing. Perhaps as much as the world hates Christians, we realize that it's still safer to be under the umbrella of the one true God than not to be. God always has his kids back. back when Zeresh told Haman, I think you should probably stop messing with the Jewish people. Now all of Persia is seeing what Zeresh saw and thought, I'm not going to mess with God's kids because I see the hand of God. And as you live your life for Christ, as you fight the good fight, they will see God's hand on your life. And they will realize that it's safer to be under the umbrella of the one true God and be one of his kids and serve him than it is to be a part of the world. Well, that's all we have for today's podcast, but we'll be back again next Wednesday for the 17th episode of our Esther series.